This is a very pretty font. But, ooh, this is also a very, ooh, I might need that. Hi everyone, my name is Amanda. This is DIY Design, the show where you learn to graphic design it yourself. Today we're going to be doing font talk. We're going to learn about fonts, when to use what kind of fonts, the types of fonts there are, the styles of fonts, how to find good fonts, and everything there is to know about fonts. First, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, Comic Sans. I'm sure that you've heard the memes and seen stuff where graphic designers just absolutely hate Comic Sans. There is a reason for that, and I want to explain why we hate Comic Sans, because I feel like it does help you understand why some fonts are appropriate and some aren't. For those of you who are unfamiliar, let me pull up a quick example in Illustrator of what Comic Sans looks like. Not using PowerPoint today because I'm just a little faster with Illustrator, and we're not really talking about the functions and controls, so Illustrator it is. But Comic Sans. Let's see what this looks like. Here it is in all of its glory. So the reason that graphic designers hate Comic Sans so much is because it is installed on every PC. It's a default font, so everybody's got it, and it looks a little more fun than some other fonts, but it is highly readable, and therefore everybody uses it. This font was developed by Microsoft back when they were going to release Microsoft Bob. They had developed Comic Sans as the system font. They decided it was a bad idea. Later on, it was still released in an update, but it was never used as a system font. It came with the machine, but it was never a default for anything. What wound up happening was that a number of scientists started using Comic Sans, and researchers used Comic Sans for children with autism, which was fantastic. A lot of children have trouble reading more complex fonts if they have a learning disability, and Comic Sans is extremely easy to read. However, because it was one of the only interesting fonts available on the default systems in early PCs and early operating systems, it got heavily overused, and it got used in all sorts of places where it wasn't appropriate. Comic Sans is one of those fonts that it has a time and a place, and it's appropriate for that. If you're a preschool, absolutely use Comic Sans in your advertisements. If you're trying to help kids to read, great font. It is fantastic for many things, but it got so overused that it just becomes a problem. And there are times when I see it in totally inappropriate situations. We always have to remember our audience. I'll see it in people's email signatures in professional emails. If you're working for a Fortune 500 company, Comic Sans should not be in your email signature. So the reason everybody hates Comic Sans is just because of its history as being an overused font. However, every font has a time and a place, except maybe Webdings, but every font has a time and a place. So let's look at some other fonts and discuss how we'd use them and why we would use certain fonts. There are really 4 different kinds of fonts. There are serif fonts, sans-serif fonts, calligraphy fonts, and heading fonts. And you can break them down further than that. You can break it down into handwriting and all sorts of various other stuff. But the primary categories: serif, sans-serif, calligraphy, and heading fonts. Let's take a look at some of each of these so we can understand the difference. So we've got our Comic Sans here. Comic Sans is a sans-serif font, but we're going to start with a serif font. Georgia is a very common, useful, great font. These little things are called serifs. They are on a lot of fonts that are used for large bodies of text because they make it easier to read. It helps the eye flow from one letter to the next without causing these major breaks in the reading pattern. A sans-serif font, san is a root word from Latin meaning without. Let's look at Helvetica. Is a sans-serif font. You notice it doesn't have these little tabs on the L or on the R, so it's missing those little tabs. Sans-serif, it doesn't have serifs. The next type of font we have is calligraphy. Let's look at Edwardian script. Edwardian script is a great one. It's I use it for a number of things. However, it's one of those that it can be difficult to read. You never want to do paragraph text in something like this. These kind of fonts need to be used very sparingly. If you're doing something where you're trying to make it look like an old handwritten letter, you might use a little bit more calligraphy. However, you still want to be really careful with how you use it and what font you choose to make sure that it's readable. Edwardian script is actually one that is relatively readable. It's not too bad, but it still should never be used in excess. And lastly, heading fonts. These are fonts that are great as a heading to give a feel for something, to set the mood for a piece. But if you were to do these as filling a body of text, let's take a look at just how bad this looks. If we were going to fill this text with it, I'm going to fill it with placeholder text. I mean, you can't read this. And just to make a point here, let's look at it. Oops. Let's look at it, the same thing, same text. I mean, you can't read it because it's in Latin, and I doubt many of the viewers here speak Latin, but let's look at it in Garamond, which is the other font we used a second ago. Do you see how much easier the letters are to make out and the words and the distinct patterns are to make out? So these heading fonts and calligraphy, which is in itself is kind of a heading font, but sometimes used as other, it's very important to be readable. We always want our audience to understand what we're trying to tell them. And using a serif font or even sometimes a sans-serif font in your body text makes it much more readable. So when you're looking for a font for a project, what should you look for? Well, the first thing we want to consider is, back to our fundamentals, is what is our audience and what are we selling to our audience? If our audience is elderly, we may want to consider an easier to read font with big letters and wider spaces between the letters so that they can easily pick out each letter. If it's for children, Comic Sans might be something we want to consider. If it's just a kind of generic, like, professional thing that you don't want to have too much of anything, then I often use, and even when I do have something specific in mind, I often use sans-serif fonts like Helvetica, or Avant-Garde, Avenir. Those are all great fonts. But if you want to consider your audience first, both you want to make sure it's appropriate for your audience so that they can read it, and for the content in your advertisement. So let's take a quick example. Let's say we have a group of teenagers who is going to London for a school trip, and we want to design a postcard that they can send back to their parents. So let's grab an image. So here's our stock image. It's a great image. And we want to keep in mind that our audience is now both the teenagers and their parents. So we have a pretty big age demographic. And again, I'm using Illustrator here. You would normally use PowerPoint, and the techniques are a little bit different, but the concept is the same. So I want to add a greetings from London to this. This is all going to be heading. There's not going to be a ton of little text, so I can use a more interesting font. I want this to appeal to both the teenagers and the adults, so let's go ahead and write out what we need to include on here. Greetings from London. Obviously this is real small, so I'm going to want to blow this up just so I can read it. Okay, greetings from London. Now we want this to, we just need the font to blend in with the background. We want it to work with everything, and we want it to look good for our teenagers or for our adults. So I'm going to start going through my fonts, looking for something that might make sense. When I'm looking at this right here, we have Garamond here, which is a serif font that I love using. However, it doesn't make sense for a heading. It doesn't look very good. Even when I try to add some contrast down here, like, it's okay. It's not ideal. It's honestly a little bit too modern for London. We want kind of a more historic feel. There are some serif fonts that would work. For example, Baskerville has a lot of is a good option, because it just does have a little bit of an older feel. However, it's still a little bit blockier than I'd like, and I want something a little bit more historic. So let's start looking through my fonts, and I've done a lot of projects for clients where I've found fonts that are specific for them. So I've got a lot of options. This one is kind of cool. It's it looks a bit more historic. I think it's a little bit too aggressive in this case. It's got some really sharp edges, and it just it feels a little bit too in your face. Let's go through and just look for a couple options and see what we've got. This one looks kind of nice. It's both modern and historic in a way. It's got a really good feeling for it. I think this one would work great here. I'm going to look at some other options. And a lot of the fonts that I'm looking at, you would have on your computer, on most computers. This one's a little bit too hard to read for me. Again, it's a little too aggressive. Castellar is a fun one. I don't think it's quite the right feel that I'm going for here. Comic Sans. All the Comic Sans, all the time. Monotype Corsiva is a nice font, but it's overused a little bit. It's another one of those fonts that's been a default for a long time, so people had it available to them, and it became a little bit overused. It can be nice in the right situation. I don't think I really want to use it here, so I'm going to keep looking. Let's keep looking for some other options. Let's scroll back down here. Oh, there we go. Sometimes when you know, you know. This is the perfect font for this situation. It has that Old English feel. It's actually called Old English text, so it's got the right feel for London. The teenagers who are visiting London are going to have seen something very similar to this across London on menus and on signage and all over the place. And the parents are going to get the feel that it's an old font. So this is exactly what I was looking for. I completely hit the nail on the head with this one. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes you just hit it right and it's just perfect. So this is what I would go with. I'd add a little drop shadow in there just to make it pop a little bit more, but that's our font. What if you don't have the perfect font? You've been through all the fonts on your computer, you can't find anything that's going to work. Well, there are some resources out there for you. This is 1001 Free Fonts. It's a website I like to use for fonts when I need something other than what I've got. If I really have a specialty thing, it's something that I need a font that really has a lot of character. And here we can download a ton of different fonts, but we do have to very much pay attention to what the licensing is for. So you see how this says free for personal use? I can't use that for something that I'm going to be earning money off of. If you're handing out a flyer that you're trying to get someone to come to an event, then this font is not appropriate for that. In this case, with the postcard for our teenagers to write to their parents, it's absolutely something we could use. We're not making money off of that postcard. Now, if we were going to design a postcard and sell it either online or in London or in our store, that would not be okay to use this font. So for personal use means that you're not making money on it, and for commercial use means that you are making money on it. That's the basics of the copyright of font. But let's go ahead and look for some fonts. We want an Old English font. Let's say we don't have the perfect font already, which we discovered we do, but let's see if we can find some good ones. So, greetings. Greetings from London is what we want. And we're going to select, we can sort by license type. So we're going to select free and public domain. So now all the fonts that are available to us, they're going to put that text in that font so that we can see what it looks like. And so now we can scroll through here and we can see our license has changed to free. And a lot of these look very, very similar. Old London would be a great one. There's a lot of things in here that are very similar. But the point is, if I didn't already have this utterly perfect font, I could use 101 free fonts or 1001 free fonts to find a good one. They'd also can sort by serif and sans-serif. So if we had decided we needed a sans-serif font specifically for this, we can sort by sans-serif. So we've got a whole lot of options here. This is a very pretty font. Ooh, this is also a very, I might need that. Well, folks, I might be the first and only graphic designer to tell you that it's okay to use Comic Sans. However, there is a time and a place for it. Like every font, there is a reason to use it and there's a reason not to use it. You have to make sure you're using it appropriately for both your audience and for the content that you are creating. If you learned something today, be sure to like and subscribe for more design content. If you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, you can click the bell or subscribe to our mailing list at the link below. You can visit us online at amandalubo.com for upcoming classes and more design tips. And go unleash your inner designer.